And we also are joined by members Heath McDonald, Sidney McEwen, who's substituting for Jamie Fox, and Brad Trivers will be joining us after a briefing he's holding. So just to let our guests know, welcome our guests, and let you know that each department will have 10 minutes opening statement. We'll be a little bit flexible with that, and then 25 minutes for questions. Each committee member gets roughly about 5 minutes. If there's further members that join, we'll give them time as well, and then there'll be a 10 to 15 minute recess break afterwards just to clean the area. And other than that, what we'll do right now is we'll pass it over to our guests to go with their briefing as asked for, and they can introduce themselves, and then the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Brad Caldwell. I'm Deputy Minister of Environment, Water and Climate Change.
I'm Barry Jackson. I'm the Environmental and Regulatory Coordinator with the Department of Environment, Water and Climate Change.
Great. And I'll just jump into our opening statement. Thanks to the committee for allowing us to come and speak. Truly appreciate it. We'll briefly start with just mentioning the pieces of legislation that follow under our ministry. First one being the Agricultural Crop Rotation Act, which is the legislation that requires the crop rotation be in place. Beverage Containers Act, legislation that supports the deposit return system for beverage containers in the province. Environmental Protection Act, the broad overarching legislation that is the core of the department in its mandate for environmental protection. There's 18 separate regulations under that act, and the act enables the creation of those regulations. The Forest Management Act, which deals for conservation management and protection of private and Crown-owned forested land of the province. Natural Area Protection Act, allowing government, private land trusts and private individuals to protect land, and Pesticide Controls Act. Purpose is to control aspects of pesticide application, storage, transport, and sale in the province for commercial and agricultural operations. The Plastic Bag Reduction Act, which I'll dive into a little deeper here in a second. Legislation that bans the use of the plastic single-use checkout bags. The Public Forest Council Act, which created the Public Forest Council for its purpose of stimulating wealth creation in provincial woodlands. That's a board that's currently not active. And the Wildlife Conservation Act, legislation that deals with wildfire protection enhancement, conservation powers, and appointments of conservation officers. Much like the groups that had presented previously, we reviewed each piece of our legislation, looking at those key elements, which I think the groups have mentioned, periods of timing, requirement for public meetings, and other pieces that could present a challenge, during the emergency we're currently under. And specifically to speak to our experience, which I was one of the questions that was asked of us. As a department, although we have a strong regulatory component to our mandate, the impacts related to COVID-19 and the legislative barriers associated with it have been minimal. Our key pieces of legislation, like the Environmental Protection Act and Wildlife Conservation Act, Beverage Containers Act, they provide the legal structure for which the departments function, but the daily operations, where many of those elements that people would have spoke to earlier throughout your committee's meetings are normally addressed in regulation. For example, the Environmental Protection Act alone, as I mentioned before, has 18 different sets of regulations to cover areas such as excavation pits, asphalt plants, auto recycling facilities, petroleum storage tanks, etc. But so I mean, in summary, with our many pieces of legislation, we don't see too many areas that would have the need for, that would be affected, much like those were mentioned before. But one challenge that did arise in the early stages of the declared state of emergency was relating to the Plastic Bag Reduction Act. Just a bit of a background, I know everyone is quite familiar with it, and certainly everyone is across the island, given the ambition and enthusiasm which everyone adopted this. So it's really greatly appreciated. With its success of the ban on plastic checkout bags at retailers, grocery stores had eliminated most of their stock as inventories were expected to be used up by January 1st. And the vast majority of customers had switched to reusable bags versus purchasing paper bags. And we expected Islanders to buy into this, but we certainly didn't appreciate just how much everyone would be keen and interested in doing that. But as the pandemic unfolded and restrictions on accessing grocery stores increased, there was certainly some uncertainty in the early stages of the pandemic. And in doing so, there was a substantial increase in demand for the ordering of online groceries. Something that's consistent with the public health recommendation on social distancing and the idea of staying at home. Each of these grocery orders would be bagged in paper. Now the plastic bag was banned ahead of customer pickup. The grocers, many had waived the convenience fees they would normally charge, in such a purchase. And a request was made to the department early on as well to eliminate the fees that would be associated with paper bags. As essential services, grocery retailers felt that these fees only increased the financial pressures that some customers were facing due to the pandemic, and it was a situation where if people wanted to use the reusable bag where there was no fee attached, they would need to go into the store, and that ran counter to what the recommendations were at the time. A bit of a background on the fees. The fees charged for bags are retained by the business. The funds that are collected from them would be used to pay for the cost of the paper bag, which is also borne by the business. And as a department, we really had no involvement in that, and the charging of those fees really became an administrative requirement associated with the legislation. So. In discussions with our department, public health felt that it was reasonable to waive the fee, so not to punish those customers who are using the paper bags and follow the advice. Another piece, which also we encountered early on, and it took a bit of a different path, is given everyone's interest in using reusable bags, early in the process there was some uncertainty on the adequate supply of paper bags for those who are doing online purchasing or other things similar. And in these early stages, when it was identified that there could be a concern on the supply, a similar request came in on not just the removal of the fees with the paper bag or allowance of the discretion with the fees with paper bags, but there was requests that plastic bags be introduced for that reason. And while it was something that was considered, after looking into it, and by that time safety protocols had been developed within the grocery stores, and clarity was starting to come forward from the health authorities on the fact that reusable bags were indeed safe and allowable, and the grocers in turn increased their educational information on using those bags. So just in summary on that piece there, given its relevance for the bill that's being debated, because I believe it was brought up a couple times in debate, the relaxation of that administrative component, that was something as a department that we felt the authorization was there, but at the time, but as time unfolded and we get to look at things with a little more scrutiny. We certainly felt that the amendments being proposed would help to formalize that temporary allowance of the fees not being charged. So that's in terms of our own departmental experience of time during the pandemic. That would be what we encountered for legislative challenges, but. I know it's something that was brought up by other groups as well, of course, without knowing what the second wave could entail. We wouldn't want to say with absolute certainty that the challenges would be limited to just what we experienced before. there's always the amount that you don't know as you move forward, and whether it be a second wave or a different type of emergency. From our analysis of our current legislation based on our current experience, this was our findings, but there's always the element of the unknown. So I'll turn it back over to you, Chair.
Great. Well, thank you for your presentation, and so at this time, we'll open it up to the floor of the committee for any questions and all questions that you might have. Lynn?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I don't have a lot of questions. First of all, thank you for presenting today. I appreciate you taking the time to do so. I did sit down in early days when we knew this bill was going to be proposed, this amendment, excuse me, was going to be proposed, and I went through the bills in this department, and there really aren't a lot of pieces of legislation that it's easy to imagine would need to be impacted during a pandemic. The Plastic Bag Reduction Act, you can see how that could be problematic in certain circumstances, but I really can't imagine removing protections on the Environmental Protection Act, for example. I can't imagine the Wildlife Conservation Act coming into effect or the Pesticide Act. None of that seems reasonable to me. Can you propose another course of action that might allow your department what it actually needed to waive these fees? Probably we don't need broad sweeping powers in order for that to have been possible. Do you see this as a simple amendment that could have been made to this act that would give you what you need in the future?
Well, it's a good question. With this particular piece, and if we're talking that one change in isolation, then perhaps it could. I mean, there's always the element of what we don't know yet, too. Certainly this was one that we didn't envision, because I mean, there was a lot of pride in our department with how the plastic bag reduction had rolled out, and it was a bit of a surprise that there was this element that would have some challenges. So to address this one concern, yes, you could have a specific amendment, but certainly I know we're not alone in having these potential amendments.
Lynn Lund?
Thank you, Chair. So the main concern from what I'm hearing as we unpacked this particular one is that more people are ordering groceries online, rightly so. It's safer, particularly for vulnerable populations, to be doing so, but they are then being charged this fee. I can see this isn't a crisis issue, certainly isn't putting anyone in harm's way. I do think that finding ways to waive those fees to make sure we are not putting undue burden on people who are struggling as it is valid, but it doesn't seem like something that needs to be done in a broad sweeping emergency way. I feel like we've identified this problem, we could probably plan for it, we could probably offer an amendment that in the case of a public health emergency or under advice from the Chief Public Health Officer, these fees could be waived. Does that seem like a fairly straightforward legislative change?
With the benefit of hindsight, yes. I mean, I think the challenge we face by times is, in February we wouldn't have envisioned, or I guess probably November, when the last time the House was sitting, that this was an issue on the horizon that could present itself, between potential opportunities for legislative amendment. So with the benefit of hindsight, then yes, that change could be made in isolation. But there's always the concern of what other ones like that could present themselves before a subsequent sitting.
I'm good.
Great.
Thank you, Chair.
Excellent. Michelle Beaton?
Hey, thanks, Chair. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you, because I can imagine that this was a huge endeavor for your department over the last 3-4 days, including the weekend. So I just wanted to say thank you, and I appreciate the diligence that your department's done in preparing this presentation for us. So one thing that we've been hearing from some of the other departments was, although it was a laborious task, it was actually a beneficial task to go through acts, to kind of go through with the new pair of eyes and to possibly see where there may be areas possibly to freshen up or for review. Did you find that with your department as you went through this as well?
That's a great question, and I'll address, and I'm sure Barry has some thoughts on this too. Yes, I mean, anytime you can take a moment to reflect on what's already in place and review it and providing that different lens upon it, you often find that it's been a beneficial exercise. So I absolutely would find that that has been the case. I mean, while we only have 9 acts ourselves, they're fairly heavy.
Yeah.
And I don't think I can say I'm new anymore. I've been here for a year, but certainly to have that refresher is great. And in doing so, you come across sections of the pieces of legislation which are quite helpful, and that reminder that exists. And Barry, you did all the work for the most part here.
No, I guess I would just add that a lot of our a lot of the legislation that we have is sort of a legislative pillar where where the operation is a lot of it happens in the regulations. So our legislation, a lot of it is relatively new, or has had enough substantial sort of reworks and structure to it over the years that it's the powers are established in the Act, but the operations are well documented in regulations. So in talks with different legislative coordinators in other departments, we were situated maybe a little bit better with a lot of our structure, or sorry, a lot of our flexibility in regulations versus stuff rigid in the Act that you have to it's more difficult to change. So looking through our list of 9 or so here, there's at least half of them that have been debated or amended or some sort of change to them on the floor of the legislature within the past decade. And certainly, an act like the beverage containers is relatively new, I guess, in terms of, that was the legislation that came into effect when the can ban was lifted. So yeah, no, I think it, as the deputy mentioned in his opening statement there, was that we are regulatory based and a heavy regulatory mandate, our department, but operationally we have a lot of this covered in our regulations. So that's helped to sort of smooth some of the bumps in the impacts from the pandemic.
Great.
Michelle Beaton?
Okay, so thank you, Barry, for all the work that you've done on this, because it's a great synopsis on your department as a whole, and from somebody who's never really looked into your department before, it's a great opportunity just to understand the legislative pieces that you maintain. So it's a good look for me too, so I appreciate that. One of the other items that's been coming up was I guess, timing of annual meetings or public engagements and those types of meeting-based requirements out of legislation. Was there any pieces of legislation that you'd want to point out that would have had that issue, or was that also something that was kind of handled throughout the operational regulations?
It's most definitely the latter, is the case for almost all of our pieces. The only instance where we encountered it was with the Public Forest Council that required a meeting of once per year, but it didn't prescribe in person. So we're still exploring what that could look like, but given that council's status right now, it wasn't relevant for this discussion here. But we really had the fortune, and Barry, certainly you and your staff and everyone in the department can pat themselves back. When legislative changes are made, there's usually a very conscious effort, recognizing that a lot of the operational things are perhaps better fit in regulations, and they've done an exceptional job of making sure that the legislation reflects that.
Okay, that's great. No questions. Thank you for that.
Anybody else? No? Great. Thank you for your presentation, and at this time what I've done with the different departments is, when you're coming in and present, you've got the information here, but if there's anything that you want to say, 2 or 3 things at this time while you're here, that could help us formulate a committee report. Just feel free to do, but you've outlined everything at this time. So I'll just pass the floor over to you for kind of closing.
Sure, I'll say a couple of comments. One, and I know I mentioned it earlier, but it's often difficult to envision what changes you may need under an emergency. So there'd be benefit in a bill such as this, providing that ability to be nimble. And I know I mentioned it before, I'll say it again too, what Barry and our staff and those at LCO and the diligent work that's been done on our pieces of legislation to ensure that a level of continuity can continue in a state like this is something that we really benefited from. And I know I'm speaking to a room of legislators who appreciate the importance when this these details are being debated on the floor. That's something that can really be beneficial, and we're really appreciative that our legislation was set up in a way to have that.
Perfect. Excellent. Perfect. Well, we thank you for coming in, and this information is valuable. And just before you leave, I might tell the committee we are ahead of schedule. So about 10 minutes ago, I talked to Ryan about potentially asking finance to come in earlier to see if we can speed up the afternoon potentially. So we'll see. I'll let you know if we can get them in maybe 15 or 20 minutes early. Start that and tell the other departments as they come in, so we can speed things up. If that's okay with the committee. Okay. At this time, we'll take an unspecified break. We're supposed to be back at 2, but we'll try to make that a little bit quicker. Okay. Thank you. Hello, this is the Standing Committee on Health and Social Development. My name is Gordon McNeely. I'm the chair. In the chamber, we have Sydney McEwen, Lynn Lund, Michelle Beaton, and Heath McDonald, and we're here to discuss motion number 75, which referred the Bill 37, an act to amend the Emergency Measures Act, to the Standing Committee on Health and Social Development. And we're going through each department, and today we have finance, and we appreciate them coming in and getting started earlier. What we'll do is we'll give you a 10-minute opening statement, give or take a few minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. We haven't needed the full allotment of time for questions thus far, so that'll be about 25 minutes. And then after that, we should be able to move on. So at this time, what I'll do is I'll pass it over to our guests to introduce themselves for Hansard, and then begin with the presentation. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jennifer McDonald Donovan. I'm the Manager of Policy Planning and Regulatory Affairs with the Department of Finance.
Good afternoon, Gordon McFadgen, Assistant Secretary to Treasury Board.
Okay. I guess I'll start.
Yep.
Honorable members of the committee, we appreciate the chance to appear on behalf of the department to discuss some of the challenges we faced during the pandemic. While we recognize the mandate of this committee is to consider legislation as it relates to Bill 37, we hope you don't mind if we take the opportunity to give credit to the dedicated public servants in finance who delivered critical services to Islanders during some very uncertain times. In the early days of COVID-19, like all Islanders, many of us were nervous to go to work. No one knew how severely the pandemic would hit our province or how long it would last. The Chief Public Health Office ordered people to stay home. In response, the Department of Transportation, Infrastructure and Energy closed government offices to the public and limited the number of people allowed to be in the building. It is within that context that our department's senior management acted to maintain essential services for Islanders while creating and delivering an unprecedented number of new emergency support programs. The Comptroller's Office continued to process an average of 15,600 payments each month for vulnerable Islanders, including clients of social development and housing and maintenance enforcement. In addition to working with departments to ensure there was no interruption of this crucial funding, this small team received 2,500 more requests compared to the same period in 2019, all specifically relating to payment processing. Our Division of Pensions and Benefits still made pension payments to more than 6,000 retired nurses, teachers, public servants, and others. Staff responded to questions from members by email or phone. The Economic Statistics and Federal Fiscal Relations Division continued to work with federal and provincial counterparts on the development of new emergency funding programs and closely monitored the impact COVID-19 was having on our economy and revenue outlook. ITSS maintained government-wide information technology systems, including service center operations, while establishing and supporting remote work arrangements so public servants across government right across the island could continue their important work. Treasury Board continued to operate with corporate finance and fiscal management teams working on the processes around funding programs while developing a second draft of the provincial budget to reflect the global economic changes that had taken place. Debt management and investment conducted our daily banking and managed our investment portfolio. While the taxation office was closed to the public, the team continued to respond to tax and property-related questions by email and phone. Staff implemented mitigation measures for property owners to help them meet 2020 property assessment and tax obligations, as well as preparing and mailing 110,000 tax and assessment notices as is required by legislation. The office processed annual HST rebate payments and ensured farmers and fishers had marked fuel permits needed for spring seasons. It met obligations under the International Fuel Tax Agreement in support of interjurisdictional truckers who were essential service providers and employed late tax payment flexibility for vendors of products such as gasoline and tobacco. As land title document registration is deemed essential, the registry office hours were maintained for title searchers, and an online alternative was provided for title searchers who were uncomfortable with on-site access. As you might imagine, the magnitude of each of these tasks was compounded under an essential service model. I can't tell you how many extra hours were logged in those early weeks, but I will say that no one complained because their focus was, first and foremost, to do what they could to support Islanders. We're so proud and grateful to work alongside such a dedicated team. While our department may be somewhat more fortunate than others in that many of our requirements around dates and waiving fees are regulatory. The property tax deferral, for an example, was enabled by a regulatory amendment. That said, we faced and continue to face significant legislative barriers. While operations are returning to normal for now, we are already considering the implications of a potential second wave and what that might mean for public accounts statutory reporting deadlines. We might also have to consider the statutory deadline for an actuary to prepare a valuation report of our pension plans, something that is used to calculate indexation for retirees. And with that, Gordon will respond directly to the questions that were asked in your letter.
I think everybody has a copy of the letter, so I'm not going to read it verbatim, but for the first question, how did COVID-19 impact the operations of your department? I think Jennifer answered that quite a bit. We were under the essential services model, but business had to be conducted through finance and through many of the functions that we're running. So we used a model of working from home and working from the office. In the early days, the staff complement in and on-site was very small, but as the second and third and now fourth, I guess on Friday, kind of phases of the recovery, if you want to call it that, we were finding more and more people coming back every day. With respect to the legislative barriers that Jennifer had indicated, the Registry Act, I guess, is one that property transactions were continuing to close, albeit not as the speed that we would find normally, but they were continuing to close, and the legislative requirements would require what they call a wet signature or an actual signature with a witness and a commissioner. So during your socially distancing and those sort of activities in the early days, that was really problematic as people were really and still are concerned for their safety. So there's no ability under the Registry Act to do a virtual signature or what I guess the real estate, some of the others have got DocuSign and some other means for electronic signatures. That's not permitted under the Registry Act. Under the Civil Service Superannuation Act, on an annual basis, there are requirements within the Act to provide indexation to pensioners, and that indexation award is based on work that's conducted by the actuaries and brought to the actual commissions for their review and approval. And depending, it's a time-sensitive thing, so if that work was unable to be done, some other means for meeting the statutory requirements for awarding or not awarding indexation would have to be undertaken. And the third, I guess there is a couple of acts that talk about timelines. And as Jennifer had mentioned, when you're talking about timelines, some of our acts are not like the Motor Vehicle Act, that your driver's license expires on your birthday, and if you happen to miss that particular day, you can have a provision. Ours, like I mentioned with the pension, the public accounts, for instance, under the FAA, requires some work to be conducted on an ongoing basis for a particular deadline on a particular day. And if, as we're thinking about a second wave, and if that wave happens and we're not at the office on October 31st, then that's the statutory deadline for public accounts, and then there would be some concern for that. With regard to question 2, what the acts, I think there's about 33 in the list. So again, I guess we're lucky that we only have a few that we would be concerned about. There are 33 in that particular listing. Which acts should be amended to accommodate responding to the state of the emergency? It's difficult, like I say, to determine in advance of an emergency, but there is a bunch of work that has to get done from our experience, and it's the preparatory work with, like I said, the public accounts and things like that, that if you're not there for the prep time, then the deadline becomes a little problematic. So that's what we would have in relation to the 3 questions asked. I think that would conclude our presentation.
Thank you very much, Gordon. That's wonderful. Wonderful. Well done. At this time, we'll open up the floor for questions for any members. Do you have any questions? Yes, Michelle Beaton?
Thank you. And thank you for this summary. So first of all, one thing I'd like to point out is when you're on the outside looking in, you don't understand necessarily all of the stages that it takes in order for especially your department to get to a certain milestone. And what COVID-19 showed us was that one of the biggest impacts to residents was financial, right? And I appreciate the fact that you've gone through all of the regular tasks that the finance department and treasury board do, because then you had all of the other stuff that was added in on top from COVID. So not only were you trying to just maintain status quo, but you were also trying to take on that extra workload. And I can see how that would have been an extremely difficult endeavor for the department to do. And I just want to say I thank you for that, because you were seamless on existing clients and then to take on that additional workload. So first of all, I just want to say thank you for the work that you did for Islanders during COVID-19, because it was, what you do is extremely important because the financial impact to Islanders. So first of all, I want to say that, and thank you for recognizing the department and for outlining that so that Islanders do know just what that undertaking was. I appreciate that. Second of all, I want to say thank you for undertaking this task, because I know on a given day to review legislation, that's an onerous task in itself, but we also asked you to do it in 4 days. So I can appreciate that was not an easy task, on top of the fact that we are going through budget right now and that you just came out of COVID-19. So first of all, I'm saying a lot of thank yous, but I think you deserve so much gratitude from us to undertake this project on top of everything else. So thank you. So there's two specific acts that you've identified as having legislative issues. Is there amendments that can be made to these acts in order to provide more flexibility, or something that can be added into the regulations to provide more flexibility if we have a second wave or another emergency that comes up at another given time? Is there something that can be done specifically for those two?
Well, first, thank you for thanking us. We have an incredible leadership team, and I guess we were working under an essential services model, so you saw a lot of the same faces working a lot of really long hours and just really not complaining. It's not just something I wrote into the remarks. They really did. And so proud that it was so seamless, you know, that people didn't notice that difference. Some of the things that we talked about, you know, with respect to property tax, like those could sort of fall in under reg changes. I think looking in the context of today, where as we were driving down, we're seeing cars at stores and everybody's kind of out and about, and I keep going back to that very first day where we were scared to even be in the same hallway with each other, absolutely terrified, and then with fewer of us there working on things. And in the idea that we can make some changes now, we would love to. I think, but we do recognize that there are some things that we might not have foreseen that could come up in future emergencies, and I think that's kind of where we were thinking. In terms of like the public accounts, that is something that there are some deadlines built in there, but there's also not a work back, you know, getting things to the Auditor General, papers moving between the Comptroller's office and that staff, who is incredibly overwhelmed right now processing all the payments on a, you know, I think for them, we don't know what another pandemic would look like or another emergency. And so of course we would have to look at what sort of amendments we could make. But I think in the context of this act, and I think we started talking about this in the early days, we didn't have any flexibility in those first few weeks. And people are calling us and asking, is it okay if this, or is it okay if we do that? And it's like, you can't tell someone it's okay to be offside with the legislation. It's really, we don't have that flexibility. And I think that's kind of where we kind of looked at it. I think from the perspective of, we can make some changes now, potentially, like we would look at that. But what happens in the next one, and what happens in subsequent emergencies, and is there any flexibility at all for those situations, like wherever possible, keeping in mind that a lot of our stuff, like for instance the Financial Administration Act, would be so and the Taxation Act and the Tax Acts, where you can't levy new fees, you can't, so a lot of our things would be around reporting deadlines. So I think that's kind of where. Gordon, do you want to say anything?
I don't think we would offer any different date. I think the date that's, if you're talking about the public accounts, it's important to have a milestone to provide the financial information on a timely basis. And not knowing what's coming, I couldn't say for certain what a better date would be. So, but if we kind of got to a second wave and it happened to happen during that October 31st, to having the overall Emergency Measure Act to kind of over the top of it to say it's okay, don't worry about that one, that would be helpful for the department for sure.
Yeah. No, I have another question. Okay.
Sidney McEwen?
Thank you, Chair. That's an interesting point to make. Gordon, you can't say what a better date would be. There's other pieces of legislation that the committee has looked at where it's like, okay, well, we can change that now that we know, but you're right, you might not know. Is there any deadlines that you were forced to miss during this part of the pandemic?
As far as legislative deadlines, no. But work deadlines, absolutely. And in my past role as former controller, there is an ongoing relationship between the office and the Auditor General on milestones. So we're definitely behind in the milestones that we would be expecting to be at in a normal year, because we're not in a normal year. So it'll be challenging to achieve the October 31st deadline for this year.
And those
Sidney
things
McEwen?
Thank you, Chair. And those things are compounded onto each other. The more and more things that happen, then potentially again this fall too.
Yeah, correct. The more sort of things that happen that take you away from the task at hand, that task at hand doesn't get addressed, and you kind of keep falling behind.
Sure.
Sidney McEwen?
Sorry, Jennifer?
Oh, no, I would just say, I think, and it may seem to be a silly thing, but in the early days of the pandemic, when you're dealing with how are we going to support islanders who are potentially out of work, or some emergency support programs, there are so many different other minor things in comparison. So in that context, sort of saying, hey, look, we're really worried about our reporting deadline for our work back on that, or government was laser focused on support programs. And so there would be smaller sort of minor things along the way that we were kind of like, we had questions about, but really you kind of have to prioritize when you have fewer people around and they're doing really critical things. And so I think, from our perspective, the ability to sort of say, okay, well, that's one thing we don't have to worry about, because what I've learned about the civil service is if they have to do something, they will find a way to do it. And whether that means they're in on evenings and weekends, whether that, that they put themselves through that, to provide that flexibility to the civil service to say, look, let's focus on this over here that's been identified as a critical priority for islanders, and that minor thing over there that sometimes can creep up. It's a legislative requirement, but you know what? In an emergency, we can ease your mind on that, because no one can tell us we're okay if you're offside with that. We can give you that flexibility. I mean, so I would just say that, just add that.
Great. Sidney McEwen?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. That makes a lot of sense, and I could see how the timelines in under your guys' legislation is tricky. Just a sidebar on the Registry Act, the ability to not have to witness wet signatures, is that something that would be in your future anyway with that process? Is that a dated process, or would that be part of, the future anyway?
It could be. It could be. I mean, it's something that we're looking at.
Okay.
It's something that but it, again, we would have to sort of say, like, in an emergency, you would be able to, and then what would that look like? So if potentially we could say, you don't have a wet signature, but you can have something that looks like this. So, yeah, those are discussions we're having, but I guess part of the problem, I guess, during this is that when we're in an emergency, and I don't think anybody could have predicted the scope of the pandemic to the extent that it impacted all of us, and we were preparing weeks in advance, but in those initial weeks, I don't know that we would have had the ability to go in and consult and make those changes, but to your point, yeah, it's something we are looking at.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you. Lynn Lund?
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to jump off on what my colleague was saying and thank you for the incredible amount of work. I really can't even imagine what it was like from your perspective having to navigate in those first couple of weeks. And we heard from constituents daily who were scared, and getting consistent service meant a lot to people. So thank you for being able to navigate in that space. I can really appreciate, particularly from the perspective of your department, why some changes might be necessary, and it would have been impossible to have imagined ahead of time what those changes could look like. I can concede that moving forward with a second wave, it would be really hard to imagine what those changes all will look like. But I also look at this amendment to the Emergency Measures Act as a bit of a Band-Aid, because it does have a sunset clause anyway. So it doesn't give us the ability for broad sweeping preparation in future emergencies regardless. It's a really short amount of time that we would be able to make these amendments. So I'm particularly interested in determining what changes you were able to identify this time that we can bring forward and amend to give you some flexibility, particularly around reporting deadlines. Those things seem, if you're trying to prioritize service to islanders and reporting deadlines, there's really no question on which one we would prefer you were focused on in an emergency. But I don't see this amendment with its sunset clause giving you the support you need into perpetuity, because we could have a third wave. Lots of pandemics in history have, and this would certainly exceed the scope of that. So I'm wondering if there are a list of most critical amendments that you think we need to make moving forward, knowing full well that even if we were to pass this amendment as it exists, it doesn't support you into the future.
Right. And thank you again for acknowledging the department, and I really will pass that along to our directors and our tax staff and registry and controller staff in particular, who were really, and just IT shared services. Just, it was impressive. We're pretty proud of them. I think that, to Gordon's point, if we were to amend the debt, and I think that's kind of where the emergency comes in, that one set date doesn't exist. I mean, unless, you were to shift, we have a couple of different dates in the Financial Administration Act around public accounts, for instance. So it's October 31st in a non-election year, it's August 31st in an election year. Unless you were to say, if a pandemic hits here, then here, but I don't know if that's feasible. But I think in terms of having that kind of, we're in a pandemic, the public accounts are due in 2 weeks. I don't know that we could have an amendment that would allow for that, specifically that work back, that sort of, like, if you look at the Comptroller's office, they have spent months sort of under the essential services model preparing programs and services for islanders. And so just trying to peck away at what they need to do for public accounts to provide them some sort of relief from the deadlines coming in, and that's a discussion to have about what that would look like. Gordon, do you want to?
Yeah, the only thing that I might add for the public accounts in particular, it is a fairly iterative process between the Office of the Comptroller and the Auditor General. So in establishing any given date, even if it was perhaps through regulation, that could be amended upon the mutual agreement of the work with, between the two offices. I think then the language in the Act could be, at its earliest convenience, with good governance, good accountability, and some of the goals and the virtues you're trying to achieve with the reporting of the public accounts. And if you left it at a little bit of a higher level and then the specific date established in regulation, then it would be a little more nimble for government for sure to respond.
Lynn Lund?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I appreciate that comment very much, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I actually think that is probably a better solution than this particular amendment, because it does have a finite amount of time that it gives you the flexibility that we're possibly looking for. Do other jurisdictions allow for that sort of looser language? Gord, could you speak to that, Gordon?
I know, I'm not aware of any. Usually it's a statutory reporting deadline. And I know when we were in the House debating it the last time it was amended, we're still sort of at the tail end of where most jurisdictions are. I think us and the Government of Canada and perhaps Newfoundland, the territories are all around October 31st, and there's some a little bit earlier than that. So I think the important point is that it has to be done annually, and it should be done as fast as it's possible, because having the information available as soon as possible, I think, is the most important thing, whatever the date is.
I agree with that, and I appreciate those comments. Thank you. I don't have any other questions.
Good. Michelle Beaton?
Great, thank you. Just wanted to touch base on the wet signatures again. So we did hear in the House when this was under debate that like death certificates and wills would have also been impacted because they would require a wet signature at the same time. So would it be fair to say, and I guess you guys can't speak to the other departments, but anybody, like, that is something in general that across government we'd have to kind of look at as a policy to be able to update in general, so that we bring that kind of up to a new standard of what a lot of organizations already use?
I think the discussion has been around wet signatures, except for during a state of emergency. Because when you're looking at a virtual means, like there would be, and I can't speak to
Anybody else, yeah.
Justice's perspective on that, but I believe for us, there is, we would only be interested in that during a state of emergency, because there would be some sort of protection in place for clients, solicitors, that kind of thing. But I haven't had any discussions with the department on outside of that.
Okay. So if we looked at the complete list of acts under the second question, is there, other than the Financial Administration Act and the, sorry, I lost my page, the Civil Service Superannuation Act, is there any others in there that would you think needed to be exempt or suspended for any other reasons? Like,
well, so I in kind of looking at it, because we did find out, to your point, we did find out about this a couple of days ago. The Condominium Act does speak to the need for annual meetings. Now, those could potentially be wrapped up in bylaw, but there are some specific requirements around the dates. The Community Development Equity Tax Credit Act also refers to returns to the minister within certain dates. But for us, and I as I say, we're unique in that we don't have a lot of deadlines within our legislation, and the ones that we do and the fees that we do would be under reg, and so they wouldn't. This probably would be. There's some key ones for us, but there would be other departments that would. And I'm thinking, transportation or justice would probably have the lion's share of things like that.
yeah,
Shall
and
we-
just one final question. I think that's what we had heard in some of the other sessions was timing, like your annual meetings or, certain, that is problematic. I think we heard in our last one that a lot of those timelines are written into the regs so that they have a little bit more flexibility. So yeah, you're not alone in the fact that there is some restrictions in, having those types of meetings or producing those types of reports that are bound by time that would be impacted in this. So it's kind of across the board, but thank you very much. I appreciate you and your presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Michelle. Anybody else besides Brad at this time? No. He just came in. At this time, I want to, thank our guests for coming and talking about, the amazing work that you've done in your department has been really, really important for Islanders. What I've done with the other groups is that, this is the time for maybe some closing remarks, maybe one or two points that you want to leave the committee with at this time, and then, just thank you again for, especially too, for the work you've done over the weekend. The timelines were pretty quick, and I want to appreciate you for coming in and doing that. So I'll pass it over to the floor for closing.
I think the only thing I would say is that, I keep remembering the first few days in the pandemic and being in the hallway and sort of all of us sort of, you normally, you pat someone on the shoulder, you touch their hand and just kind of realizing you couldn't do that anymore and how very different the world was and how frightening it was. And I was, as the business continuity coordinator for the department, working with all the different directors to make sure that can we do everything we need to do. And in those early days, I think the ability to have flexibility in some cases, we continue to do everything that we do generally. We continue to abide by the legislation. But I would say that to have that sort of comfort that some of the work backs that they needed to do, that people who are in a position where they're working really hard generally, and then on top of something else, and then worrying about something else, to have that comfort, I think that's sort of where we had determined that would perhaps provide us some flexibility. And so, in looking at today, I think it's great that we're able to look back and say, we could make some changes, or we could do this, or we could amend that. And I think this is just an initial, to your point, an initial glance at our legislation. I don't know if something else is going to come up over the next few months that someone could say, oh my goodness, I hadn't realized that would be something that we would need to do. And for an example, I use the Civil Service Superannuation Act. And I mean, in the initial days where we asked the department, do you have any concerns right now about, things you can't do or can't do? Do you have any questions? I don't think this was one that would have even come up then because it seemed so far away. But should a second wave hit tomorrow, and we're not able to make those changes, I think that's kind of where the discussion had been on this legislation. But Gordon, is there anything you wanted to add?
No, the only thing that I would say is that it was a good wake-up call, I guess, for government to be working on things that we should be working on every day to try to make life better for everyone, whether it be wet signatures or whatever. The business practices of government have to keep evolving, and not the best way, I guess, to get a wake-up call to do that, but I think it was a nice reminder that we need to be progressive in the way we deliver services, particularly to Islanders.
Perfect. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for coming in. I'll remind the committee our next presenters are here, but we'll give ourselves a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back. And just to keep in mind to keep the day flowing, after fisheries we have new business. If now you're thinking about any new business about things that you've heard today, think about it for that section, and please relate it to this 14-day period that we're under, and not the Health and Social Development Committee as a whole. Okay, so we'll take 5 minutes and we'll be back. Thank you. Thank you. We're back. This is the Standing Committee on Health and Social Development. We're here to discuss considerations for motion number 75 that was referred to this committee from the Legislative Assembly, talking about Bill 37, an act to amend the Emergency Measures Act. I'd like to welcome our guests as well, and I'll give you time for remarks and to state your name in a second. In the committee, we have Sidney McEwen, Brad Trivers, Lynn Lund, Michelle Beaton, and Heath McDonald, and I'm Gordon McNeely, the chair. So each person, you'll be given an opening 10-minute statement, give or take that. Then we'll open it up for questions. We haven't needed the full amount of questions so far, so we'll be fluid with that. And then after that, you'll have ample time to answer the questions and go through things. So at this time, I'm going to pass it over to you to state your name for Hansard and then begin your presentation. Thank you.
My name is Christine McKinnon. I'm the Director responsible for Municipal Affairs.
Daryl O'Brien, Rural Policy Coordinator with the Department of Fisheries and Communities. Mr. Chair, as requested in your letter to the Minister of Finance and Communities dated June 18th, 2020, I'd like to read a response to the 3 questions posed by the Standing Committee on Health and Social Development, if that's okay.
Sure.
The first question, how did the COVID-19 pandemic impact the operations of your department? The Department of Fisheries and Communities is comprised of 4 divisions: aquaculture, marine fisheries, municipal affairs, and rural and regional development. The responsibility for the Employment Development Agency also falls under the department. From the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic, the department used the evidence provided by the experts in the Chief Public Health Office to make planning decisions to protect staff and the public from possible exposure to COVID-19. During the early stages of the pandemic and the public health state of emergency, most programs and services were offered virtually. For example, issuing fish buyers, peddlers, and processors license was conducted online. The EDA continued to assist individuals secure employment, and fish inspectors were safely able to conduct inspections while social distancing and using the appropriate personal protective equipment. The Municipal Affairs Division continued to provide resources and expert advice to municipalities during the pandemic. The department is one of the smaller government departments, and we were successful at adapting to the circumstances by being flexible and resilient and continuing to offer important services to islanders during these trying times. As we look ahead to the potential of a second wave, we'll continue to examine how programs and services are delivered and use the learnings from the last few months to guide us through the pandemic. The next question, which acts fall under your department's area of responsibility? The Department of Fisheries and Communities is responsible for the following 5 acts: the Certified Fisheries Organization Support Act, the Employment Development Agency Act, the Fisheries Act, the Fish Inspection Act, and finally, the Municipal Government Act. I'd like to turn this presentation over to Christine McKinnon to address the 3rd question and add some concluding remarks. Thanks.
Thank you, Daryl. In response to question 3, I'm going to provide some high-level commentary on the types of provisions that may be needed to accommodate an emergency. Please note that this response should be not taken as an indication that change to the statutes is necessary or appropriate at this time, but rather it highlights the types of provisions that are in the legislation. Although the department is responsible for 5 acts, only the Municipal Government Act requires some amendments to accommodate a public health state of emergency. Under the Municipal Government Act, the minister has the authority to extend deadlines, and this was done using a ministerial order effective March 16th, 2020. There are many good reasons to extend administrative deadlines. For example, to extend the time to have a by-election or to defer annual reporting requirements. This makes sense for the type of delays that we anticipated. There could be a fire or a flood at a public building, a death in the community, a storm, or a power outage. These delays are measured in days. This does not waive the requirement to do things, it simply allows more time. No one anticipated a situation where no one could gather in large groups for weeks or months at a time. In addition, the Planning Act, under the Department of Agriculture and Land, provides legislative authority for municipal land use planning and requires public hearings before making decisions that may impact future enjoyment of property, the environment, or changes to the long-term use of property. In terms of some examples under the Municipal Government Act, there is a requirement that council and committee meetings be physically open to the public, unless they've been closed for specific circumstances requiring confidentiality. Clearly, this wasn't possible with the social distancing and CPHO protocols. What could change is to waive the requirement to allow the public to attend physically, but keep or add a requirement to allow the public to observe a live broadcast. As a different example, virtual participation by some members of council and entirely virtual meetings of councils and committees is provided for. It is possible to waive the requirement to enable virtual meetings in a municipality's procedural bylaw, but they should keep or add the requirement to allow the public to observe a live broadcast. Similarly, right now there is a requirement to provide a staffed facility where the public can view virtual proceedings or meetings of council. Clearly, this cannot adhere to social distancing or other CPHO requirements. One of the specific questions that came up a lot at the end of March was the requirement to have a public meeting 2 weeks before passing the municipal council budget. Again, it was a requirement that could not be safely adhered to because of social distancing or CPHO requirements. The change could be to waive the requirement for the in-person meeting, but keep or add the requirement to make information available to the public prior to council's adoption of a financial plan in lieu of a public meeting. There are a number of requirements around public hearings, and it's important to keep the requirement to have a live broadcast and some other manner to provide comments when it's not possible to adhere to the CPHO requirements. Often, as others have mentioned, legislation may be assigned responsibility in one department, but it's also connected to legislation across government. For example, the changes related to the Planning Act can impact municipalities and the Municipal Government Act. There are 29 municipal planning authorities that are responsible for land use planning in their boundaries. These municipalities must also comply with other provincial legislation, such as the Roads Act, Employment Standards Act, Environmental Protection Act, just to name a few. Changes to these statutes may add to the administrative or legal burden at an already difficult and stressful time for municipalities. And it's important to try to streamline provincial advice so that it's easily understood in difficult times. Without advanced knowledge of the exact circumstance of the next COVID-19 wave, it's difficult to provide certainty about which legislation needs to be suspended or varied. Amendments to the Emergency Measures Act are intended to temporarily address the legislative issues that were recently identified and consider some flexibility for issues that have yet to be identified. It's very important to conduct the proper research and analysis with consultation and expert review to make sure that the change is both necessary and appropriate now and moving forward. To conclude, these are measures of last resort and will help to protect island residents and ensure they have access to government programs and services with as little disruption or impact as possible. While we've been able to pivot and continue to provide services, we can't fully know what a second wave will look like or how it will impact the department. They're very important questions, and I want to express my thanks and appreciation for your attention today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Great presentation. And at this time, I'll open it up to the floor for questions from the members. Yeah. Michelle Beaton?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation today. I appreciate that. I come from a very small rural municipality, and we do have in-person meetings, and so I do understand the complication for them of how to stay in line with the Act and also with Public Health Office, so I do understand the suggestions. So, and I realize that there are municipalities out there too that already do online, or I guess have moved very quickly towards online meetings. You know, Stratford, for instance, was one of them, and I've probably watched more municipal council meetings since COVID-19 hit than I did before. So I think that might even be a benefit of it. So just a quick question. Is this something that you think should be viable in the legislation regardless of an emergency, so that a municipality would be able to hold an online meeting anyway? Or would it only be during the time of an emergency that they would have that ability to do it?
Under the Municipal Government Act now,
Yeah.
a municipality may hold virtual meetings. They just have to describe them in a procedural bylaw so that the public is clear about how they can access the council meetings and information. So there's no change required to hold a virtual public meeting of a council or a committee.
Okay.
Michelle Beaton?
So can you just clarify that the difference here, like just on your first first requirement that council and committee meetings be physically held in public, that's what's in the MGA today. So that's a different section then, I assume, is it?
They can make a provision through their procedural bylaw to allow a member of their council to participate virtually, to come in and out of, for example, a situation where someone is working out west, for example, and they want to maintain a role on council, they are able to participate in a meeting. The requirement that's there is that if the whole council is meeting virtually, there has to be a way for the public to see and engage in what's going on. And part of the requirement today is that the municipality provide a room where the public can go to watch if they don't have access to online experience of presentation.
Okay.
Michelle Beaton?
Thank you, Chair. So in general, even outside of the emergency, it kind of sounds like that would be beneficial to have anyway, to allow for residents to be able to watch proceedings virtually.
The concern is the social distancing and safety of staff and the public.
Right, so
Shelley.
in that public room that's being available for them to watch, if they don't have access to be able to watch it virtually. So if they're on rural internet, for instance, and they can't actually access the proceedings online. Okay. All right, I'm good right now.
Thank you, Michelle. Lynn Lund?
Thank you, Chair. So first of all, thank you for your presentation. I found this very helpful. And like my colleague, I also think that some of these recommendations would be good recommendations even outside the scope of an emergency. Allowing the public to view proceedings from home would be useful even outside of an emergency for people who have mobility issues, for example. So these sound like good recommendations regardless. And something that we've heard a number of presenters say today is that it's hard to predict what the next pandemic would look like, so it's hard to know exactly what all of the recommendations that should be made in advance and what changes need to happen in advance should be, which is the need for this amendment to the Emergency Measures Act. But I note that the Emergency Measures Act will have a sunset clause on it anyway. So we won't be allowing changes into the future regardless. It would really be to address a short amount of time. So I just wonder if there isn't some merit in bringing forward amendments to the MGA anyway to make sure that these changes are able to happen in the future. Would you think that was a useful move?
Oh, certainly. Ways to streamline and provide additional transparency are very important.
Yeah. No further questions. Thank you so much.
Heath McDonald?
So the municipality would have to change their bylaws in this regard, is that what you're kind of saying?
A municipality would have a procedural bylaw to describe how they deal with public meetings and access for the public. Yes.
So
Heath McDonald?
would that not be more of a regulation for you guys to change as opposed to if they came to you with an outline of virtual meetings or whatever, would that not be more of a regulation as opposed to an actual legislative?
I describe the Municipal Government Act as the guardrails that allow municipalities a lot of flexibility and choice depending on their capacity. Were we to prescribe in detail what's required for a public meeting, there may be some municipalities that don't feel that's appropriate in their community, and they may wish to have somewhat more flexibility depending on the high-speed internet in their area. So we've tried to broadly accommodate and allow the choice by municipalities, but being more prescriptive is certainly one option.
That's fine, thank you.
Okay, perfect. Any other questions from the members at this time? Great. Thank you for coming in today, and what I've done with the other groups is just offered a chance to, now that you've heard some questions, maybe do one or two things that you would like to leave us with, although your presentation was pretty detailed, and you know, thank you for coming in. I know this might have meant a little more work over the weekend, but we appreciate it, and the people at PEI appreciate it. So I'll pass it over to you for my closing statement.
Yeah, thank you. I think we would say it was a positive experience overall to review the departmental business through that pandemic lens to know where, moving forward, we may need to re-examine the legislation and regulations. So I think I would say that was a positive for sure. Christine, do you have any?
Thank you. I'll just follow up, excuse me, a bit on the last conversation. In general, I would steer away from prescribing what are acceptable alternative formats for PEI municipalities, but it's very important to focus on the principles that a public hearing should meet and encourage municipalities to do their best given their own capacities and the capacities of their community.
Options, great. Perfect. Well, thank you for coming in. What we'll do now, committee, is we have a little bit of business to conclude with, I do believe, at the end of the day, so we'll give our presenters 30 seconds to a minute. You don't have to run out of here, but we'll be back to finish up as soon as we can. So ready to go. Okay, we'll just finish up I think this might be very quick, but there was a question of admissibility of Friday's motion. So members, there was a question of the motion passed on Friday. I would remind the members that if they have questions on admissibility of a motion before the committee, the opportunity to raise that is during the debate and not afterwards. There's an ample opportunity for discussion on Friday on the particular motion, and it was repeated several times for clarity. And, you know, if we want, I think motions are a good thing as we move forward, and we'd like to have a debate and make sure we get it straight, especially when we have this 14-day period. So, continue to bring those forward. I just thought I'd read that.
Was it an appropriate motion?
Yes, it was an appropriate motion. Correct? Appropriate, yeah.
Yeah, you got the plexiglass on your side.
It was appropriate. Yeah. So at this time, I'm just thinking about new business. Does anybody have any new business at the moment? No? I think today's format worked pretty well with the departments, and I might make a suggestion to Ryan is that we're starting tomorrow at 9 a.m. And if they go, we've allocated an hour. If they start to go a little bit faster, just make sure we reach out to those departments that are on tomorrow morning and see if we can maybe speed them up a little bit. Not speed them up, but give ample time, but just make sure they're ready to go, so we can save some time on a busy day for us. Other than that, I would just need, at this time, if anybody's okay, we just need a motion to adjourn. Michelle Beaton.